The morning sun barely broke through the thick fog rolling in from the Pacific Ocean as Commander Jake Morrison pulled his truck into the parking lot of the Naval Special Warfare Center in Coronado. The base was already alive with activity, young SEALs running drills on the beach, their determined faces set against the cold ocean breeze. Jake had been commanding this unit for 3 years now, and every morning felt like both a privilege and a heavy responsibility. As he walked toward the main gym facility, he noticed the same figure he'd seen for months now. An old man, probably in his 70s, pushing a cleaning cart slowly across the concrete pathway. The man wore a simple gray maintenance uniform, his shoulders slightly hunched, his movements careful and deliberate. His hair was white and thin, cut military short, and his face carried deep lines that spoke of a long life lived. Jake had seen this janitor countless times, but had never really looked at him. That was the thing about people who cleaned and maintained places. They became invisible, part of the background, noticed only when something wasn't done right. The commander felt a small pang of guilt about that as he held the door open and watched the old man slowly push his cart through. "Thank you, sir," the janitor said quietly, his voice rough like gravel. His eyes didn't quite meet Jake's, and he moved past quickly, disappearing into the locker room area. Inside the gym, the energy was electric. Dozens of Navy SEALs were training, pushing their bodies to limits most people couldn't imagine. Weights clanked, ropes whipped through the air, and the sound of heavy bags being pounded filled the space. This was where warriors were forged, where the best of the best came to maintain their edge. Jake went through his own workout routine, harder than he probably needed to at his age. But he believed in leading by example. He was on the rowing machine when he noticed the old janitor again, this time emptying trash cans along the far wall. The man moved with purpose despite his age, methodical and thorough. There was something almost military about the way he worked, Jake thought. Everything squared away, nothing left to chance. After his workout, Jake headed to the locker room to shower and change. The facilities were immaculate as always, fresh towels stacked perfectly, floors spotless, not a single piece of trash anywhere. Someone took real pride in keeping this place right, he thought. That's when he saw him again. The old janitor was on his hands and knees, scrubbing at a stubborn stain on the tile floor near the showers. His face was red from exertion, sweat beading on his forehead. Most guys his age would have given up or done a half job, but this man was working like his life depended on getting that floor clean. "You're doing a great job keeping this place shipshape," Jake said, trying to be friendly. The old man looked up, startled, as if he wasn't used to being spoken to. "Just doing my job, Commander," he replied, then went back to scrubbing. Jake noticed something then, just a glimpse. When the old man turned his head, the collar of his uniform shirt shifted slightly, revealing the edge of what looked like a tattoo on his neck. It was only visible for a second before the man adjusted his collar, but Jake's curiosity was piqued. Over the next few weeks, Commander Morrison found himself paying more attention to the quiet janitor. The man arrived every morning at 5:30, even earlier than most of the training staff. He worked steadily through the day, never complaining, never asking for help. He ate his lunch alone on a bench outside, always the same thing from what Jake could tell, a simple sandwich and an apple. He spoke to almost no one. The other maintenance workers were friendly and chatted with the SEALs, but not this old man. He kept his head down and did his work. Some of the younger sailors made jokes about the ghost janitor, who barely said 2 words. But Jake noticed something they didn't. The old man's eyes, when they occasionally met someone's gaze, weren't empty or defeated. They were watchful, alert, taking everything in. Those were eyes that had seen things. One morning, Jake arrived extra early to catch up on paperwork. The gym was nearly empty. Just a few dedicated sailors getting their pre-dawn workout in. The janitor was there too, mopping the entryway. Jake watched him work for a moment. The man's movements were efficient, economical. He didn't waste motion. He positioned his mop bucket exactly where it needed to be, worked in a pattern that made sense. It reminded Jake of how you'd clear a building, systematic and smart. "Been doing this work long?" Jake asked, approaching casually. The old man paused, leaning on his mop. "Few years now, sir, since I moved back to the area." "You from around here originally?" "Spent some time here, long time ago. The janitor's voice was neutral, giving nothing away. Navy man? Jake asked, taking a guess. The briefest hesitation. I served, yes sir. Long time ago. Before Jake could ask more, another sailor called for the commander's attention, and the moment passed. But Jake filed it away. There was more to this old man than met the eye. The base was preparing for a major training exercise, and everyone was working overtime. The gym stayed open later, and the facility was taking a beating from the increased use. Jake often found himself working late into the evening, and he noticed the old janitor was always there too, working just as long, making sure everything stayed clean and operational. One evening, around 8 o'clock, Jake was finishing up some reports in the small office adjacent to the gym. Through the window, he could see the old man stripping and waxing the gym floor, a job that would take hours. The man worked alone, slowly but steadily, running the buffer machine back and forth with practiced ease. Jake decided to take a break and walked out into the gym. The smell of floor wax was strong, and the wet floor gleamed under the lights. You're putting in long hours, Jake said. The janitor turned off the buffer machine. Floor needs doing. Can't have the team's training on a messed up surface. Someone could slip, get hurt. There it was again. That concern for the mission, for the men. That wasn't typical janitor talk. That was the talk of someone who understood what this place was about, what these men were training for. What's your name? Jake asked, realizing with some shame that he'd never bothered to find out. Henry, sir. Henry Mitchell. How long did you serve, Henry? The old man's jaw tightened slightly. 26 years, sir. 26 years. That was a career. That was a life dedicated to service. Jake felt the weight of that answer. What did you do? Henry Mitchell looked at the commander for a long moment as if deciding something. This and that, sir, where they needed me. It was a non-answer, but something in the way he said it told Jake not to push. Not yet. The training exercise went off well, and afterward, the commanding admiral hosted a reception for visiting brass and some local VIPs. It was held in the gym, which had been transformed for the occasion. Tables with white cloths, a makeshift bar, even a small stage for speeches. Jake had to admire how good the place looked. Someone had put in serious work to make this happen. During the reception, Jake spotted Henry Mitchell in the corner, emptying a trash can. The old man was trying to be invisible, doing his job without disturbing the guests. But one of the visiting officers, a loud captain who'd had too much to drink, knocked into Henry, spilling his champagne. Watch where you're going, old man, the captain barked. Henry immediately apologized, even though it clearly wasn't his fault. He started to clean up the spill, but the captain kept berating him, making a scene. Jake saw Henry's hands, saw them trembling slightly, not from fear or age, but from what looked like controlled anger. The old man's face remained neutral, but his eyes had gone hard. Jake intervened, smoothly guiding the drunk captain away and suggesting he get some fresh air. When he looked back, Henry was gone, having cleaned up the mess and disappeared like smoke. Later that night, after the reception ended and the last guests had left, Jake stayed to help with cleanup. He found Henry in the storage room, putting away supplies. The old man looked tired, more tired than Jake had ever seen him. Sorry about that, Captain, earlier, Jake said. He was out of line. Henry shrugged. I've dealt with worse, sir. Something in his tone made Jake pause. Yes, this man probably had dealt with much worse than a drunk officer with a big mouth. That tattoo on your neck, Jake said, deciding to be direct. I've only caught glimpses of it, but it looks military. Henry's hand unconsciously went to his collar, adjusting it to make sure it was covered. Old ink, sir, from a long time ago. What unit were you with? The old man was quiet for so long Jake thought he wouldn't answer. Finally, Henry spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. I'd rather not say, sir. It's in the past. I'm just a janitor now. But the way he said it, the pain in his voice, told Jake this was a man carrying something heavy, something that still hurt after all these years. The weeks passed, and Jake found himself increasingly curious about Henry Mitchell. He did some digging, but the old man's service records weren't in the usual databases. What he did find was a Henry Mitchell who had served in the Navy, but large portions of his file were redacted or classified. That was unusual. Very unusual. Jake started watching more carefully. He noticed things. The way Henry moved, even at his age, was different from other elderly men. When he carried heavy equipment, his posture was perfect. When he turned corners, he looked both ways, always aware of his surroundings. And his hands, when they weren't holding a mop or trash bag, hung at his sides in a way that suggested he'd spent a lot of time holding a weapon. One day, a group of young SEAL candidates were in the gym, talking loudly about an upcoming training exercise in Southeast Asia. They were excited, full of bravado, talking about all the things they were going to do. Henry was cleaning nearby, and Jake saw him pause for just a moment, saw something flicker across his face. Recognition? Memory? Pain? It was hard to say, but it was something deep. After the young men left, Jake approached Henry. "You ever get out to that part of the world?" Henry's hands tightened on his mop handle. "Vietnam, sir. Long time ago." The pieces were starting to come together. Vietnam era, classified service records, combat skills that even age couldn't completely hide. Jake's mind was racing with possibilities. "What years?" he asked gently. 68 to 72, Henry said quietly. "The worst of it. Those were the bloodiest years of the war." Jake knew his history. He also knew that during that time, special operations units were doing things in Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia that the public never heard about, operations that were still classified decades later. Before Jake could ask more, his phone rang. It was an emergency call from headquarters. One of his teams had run into trouble during a training exercise. He had to go immediately. "We'll talk later, Henry," he said, already moving toward the door. "Yes, sir," Henry replied, going back to his mopping. But as Jake rushed out, he made a decision. He was going to find out who Henry Mitchell really was. This man deserved better than to be invisible, to be treated like he was nothing. If he had served his country in the ways Jake was beginning to suspect, he deserved recognition, respect, honor. The question was, why was he hiding? What had happened to make a man who might have been a warrior choose to spend his final years pushing a mop and emptying trash cans? What was he running from? Or what was he trying to forget? Jake didn't know it yet, but he was about to uncover a story that would shake him to his core. A story of sacrifice and betrayal, of heroism that had been buried and forgotten. And it all started with a tattoo on an old man's neck. A tattoo that Henry Mitchell had tried so hard to keep hidden from the world. Commander Jake Morrison spent the next 2 days dealing with the aftermath of the training accident. One of his men had broken his leg during a night parachute jump. Nothing life-threatening, but it meant paperwork, reports, and meetings with safety officers. By the time things settled down, Jake had almost forgotten about his conversation with Henry Mitchell. Almost, but not quite. On the third morning, Jake arrived at the gym before dawn. He'd barely slept, his mind churning with questions about the quiet janitor. He found Henry in the equipment room, organizing weights that the previous day's training had left scattered. The old man worked in the dim light, his movements slow but deliberate, placing each dumbbell back in its proper place on the rack. "Morning, Henry," Jake said from the doorway. Henry turned, surprise crossing his weathered face. "Commander, you're here early." "Couldn't sleep. Thought I'd get a jump on the day." Jake paused, then decided to take a chance. "I did some checking on your service record." Henry's expression didn't change, but his hands stopped moving. He carefully set down the weight he was holding. "Did you now, sir?" "Most of it's classified. Redacted." "That doesn't happen for regular sailors, Henry. That happens for special operations, for people who did things the government doesn't want talked about." The old man was quiet for a long moment. The only sound was the hum of the ventilation system and the distant crash of waves on the beach outside. Finally, Henry spoke, his voice tired. "Some things are classified for good reason, Commander. Some things should stay buried." "Is that why you're here? Working as a janitor? Trying to stay buried?" Henry's jaw worked, and for a moment, Jake thought he saw moisture in the old man's eyes. "I'm here because it's the only place I know anymore, sir. This world, the military, it's all I understand. But I can't be part of it, not really. not after everything. So, I clean. I maintain. I do what I can. Jake felt something tighten in his chest. What happened, Henry? But the old man just shook his head and went back to organizing weights. The conversation was over. Jake couldn't let it go. He reached out to an old friend at Naval Special Warfare Command headquarters, a captain named Rodriguez who had connections in the intelligence community. If anyone could dig deeper into Henry Mitchell's past, it was Rodriguez. 2 weeks passed. Jake went about his duties, training his teams, overseeing operations, doing all the things a SEAL commander does. But he watched Henry too. He saw things he'd missed before. The way Henry always positioned himself with his back to walls. How he never seemed surprised by anything, as if he'd already assessed every possibility before it happened. The scars on his hands, old marks that spoke of hard fighting in close quarters. And then there was the tattoo. Jake caught glimpses of it now and then. It was some kind of symbol, dark ink faded by time, but definitely military in nature. Henry always covered it quickly when he noticed anyone looking, but Jake was determined to get a better look. The opportunity came during the base's annual physical fitness competition. The gym was packed with sailors competing in various events. The energy was high, and everyone was in good spirits. It was a hot day, unseasonably warm even for San Diego, and many people had shed extra layers. Jake was spotting for one of his men on the bench press when he saw Henry across the gym, dragging large trash bins out to be emptied. The old man had rolled up his sleeves and unbuttoned the top of his uniform shirt because of the heat, and there it was, fully visible for the first time. The tattoo on Henry's neck. Jake's breath caught. He recognized it immediately. It was a skull with a trident through it, crossed with a small dagger. Below it were numbers that looked like a date. But it wasn't any standard Navy tattoo. This was something specific, something Jake had only seen in old classified documents and historical photos. It was the insignia of MAC-V-SOG, the Military Assistance Command, Vietnam Studies and Observations Group, the most secretive, most dangerous special operations unit of the Vietnam War. These men had conducted cross-border raids into Laos and Cambodia, deep reconnaissance missions behind enemy lines, prisoner rescues, and assassinations. They had the highest casualty rate of any American unit in the war. They were legends, and their operations were so classified that many of their missions were still secret more than 50 years later. Henry Mitchell had been one of them, a ghost soldier, operating in places the American government claimed they'd never been, doing things that officially never happened. Jake felt like he'd been punched in the gut. This man, this quiet janitor who everyone ignored, who cleaned their toilets and mopped their floors, was a genuine war hero, one of the most elite warriors America had ever produced. And he was invisible, forgotten, pushing a mop in the twilight of his life. At that moment, Rodriguez called. Jake stepped outside to take it, his mind still reeling from what he'd discovered. "Jake, I got that information you requested," Rodriguez said, his voice serious. "But this is heavy stuff, brother. Are you sure you want to know?" "Tell me everything," Jake said. What Rodriguez told him over the next 20 minutes changed everything Jake thought he knew about Henry Mitchell. The old janitor wasn't just a SOG veteran. He'd been a team leader, one of the most decorated members of the unit, though most of his medals were classified and couldn't be publicly acknowledged. He'd run missions that saved American lives, that disrupted enemy supply lines, that extracted intelligence that changed the course of battles. But then something had gone wrong. In 1971, Henry's team had been sent on a mission into Laos to recover a downed pilot. They'd been betrayed, their landing zone compromised. The team had walked into an ambush. Of the 12 men who went in, only 3 came out. Henry was one of them, but he'd been badly wounded. He'd carried another injured man for 3 miles through enemy jungle to reach an extraction point. He'd been awarded the Navy Cross, the second highest decoration for valor, but the award was classified. Officially, he'd never been in Laos. Officially, the mission never happened. And when the war ended and SOG was disbanded, the men who survived were scattered, their service records sealed, their sacrifices unacknowledged. Henry had tried to continue serving, but the physical and psychological wounds were too deep. He'd been medically retired in 1972 at the age of 26, given a small pension, and sent back to civilian life with orders never to speak about what he'd done. He'd struggled for years with what they now called PTSD. He'd lost contact with the few team members who survived. He'd drifted from job to job, unable to fit into normal society, unable to explain the nightmares, the hypervigilance, the feeling of being out of place in a world at peace. Eventually, he'd ended up back in San Diego, taking the janitorial job at the SEAL base. Rodriguez's source suggested that Henry felt safe here, surrounded by warriors who understood, even if they didn't know his story. The military routine, the discipline, the sense of purpose. It helped him cope. "There's one more thing," Rodriguez said. "The man he carried out of that jungle in Laos, the one he saved, he died 3 weeks after they got back. Infections from his wounds." Henry apparently blamed himself, felt like he should have moved faster, should have done more. That's what broke him, Jake. Not the combat, not the wounds, the feeling that he'd failed his brother. Jake stood there in the parking lot, phone pressed to his ear, tears in his eyes. Henry Mitchell had given everything for his country. He'd fought in the shadows, had bled and watched his friends die, had carried those wounds for more than 50 years. And his reward was to be forgotten, to work a minimum wage job, to be invisible. That night, Jake couldn't sleep. He kept thinking about Henry, about all the times he'd walked past the old man without really seeing him. How many other people did that every day? How many young SEALs trained in that gym, never knowing that one of the greatest warriors of his generation was emptying their trash cans? At 2 a.m, Jake made a decision. He couldn't change what had happened to Henry Mitchell. He couldn't give him back the years of suffering, couldn't bring back his fallen brothers. But he could do something. He could make sure this man wasn't invisible anymore. The next morning, Jake requested a meeting with the base commander, Captain Sarah Chen. She was a no-nonsense officer who'd worked her way up through the ranks and had a reputation for fairness and intelligence. "I need to talk to you about one of our maintenance workers," Jake began. And then he told her everything. About Henry, about SOG, about the classified service record, about the Navy Cross that nobody knew existed. He showed her the information Rodriguez had sent, official enough to prove the story, but not so classified that sharing it would land them both in legal trouble. Captain Chen listened intently, her expression growing more serious with each revelation. When Jake finished, she sat back in her chair and was quiet for a long moment. "My God," she finally said. "This man has been here for how long?" "4 years, ma'am. Working quietly, never complaining, never asking for anything. And nobody knew? He didn't want anyone to know. I think he's been running from his past, or maybe just trying to exist without the weight of it." Captain Chen stood and walked to her window, looking out at the base, at the young sailors going about their morning routines. "We have to do something, Jake. This man deserves better." "I agree, ma'am. But it has to be done right. Henry's been hurt enough. If we make a big public thing out of this, and it embarrasses him or brings up painful memories, we'll be doing more harm than good. So, what do you suggest?" Jake had been thinking about this all night. "Let me talk to him first, build his trust, find out what he wants, what he needs. Then we can figure out the right way to honor him." Captain Chen nodded. "Agreed. But Jake, whatever we do it right. This man is a hero, even if his heroism was classified. We owe him that recognition." Finding the right moment to talk to Henry proved harder than Jake expected. The old man seemed to sense that something had changed, that Jake knew more than he'd revealed. Henry became even more elusive, finishing his work quickly and disappearing before Jake could catch him alone. Finally, after a week of near misses, Jake waited outside the base gates at the end of Henry's shift. He saw the old man walking toward the bus stop, lunch pail in hand, moving with that careful economy of motion that never seemed to change. "Henry, wait," Jake called, jogging to catch up. The old man turned, and Jake saw wariness in his eyes. "Commander, I need to talk to you. Can I give you a ride home?" Henry hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. "Bus is fine, sir." "Please, it's important." Something in Jake's tone must have convinced him because Henry nodded slowly and followed Jake to his truck. They drove in silence for a few minutes, Henry staring out the window at the passing streets. "I know who you are," Jake finally said. "I know about SOG. I know about the Navy Cross. I know about Laos." Henry's face went pale. His hands gripped his lunch pail so tightly his knuckles turned white. "You had no right to dig into that, sir." "Maybe not. But I did. And now I know that one of the bravest men I've ever met has been invisible for years, treated like he doesn't matter, when the truth is, you're a genuine American hero." "I'm not a hero," Henry said, his voice rough with emotion. "I'm the man who got 9 of his brothers killed. I'm the man who couldn't carry his friend fast enough to save him. I'm the man who came home when better men didn't." Jake pulled the truck over to the side of the road and turned to face Henry. "Is that what you've been telling yourself all these years? That you failed?" "I did fail. They trusted me to lead them, and I led them into an ambush. You were betrayed. The intelligence was wrong. That wasn't your fault. I should have seen it, should have known. You saved 3 men, Henry. You carried a wounded man 3 miles through enemy jungle, while you yourself were bleeding. You fought off enemy soldiers, called in air support, coordinated the extraction. You did everything humanly possible." Tears were running down Henry's face now, the first time Jake had seen the old man's composure crack. It wasn't enough. Jimmy died anyway. 22 years old. And he died in a hospital bed because I wasn't fast enough. Jake reached out and gripped Henry's shoulder. "You gave him a chance. Without you, he would have died in that jungle. You gave him 3 more weeks. Gave him a chance to say goodbye. To be with people who loved him. That matters, Henry. That means something." Henry shook his head, unable to speak. The weight of 50 years of guilt and pain was visible on his face, in the slump of his shoulders, in the trembling of his hands. "The Navy gave you a Navy Cross," Jake continued gently. "Do you know how rare that is? Do you know what that means? It means that even with everything that went wrong, even with the losses, you demonstrated extraordinary heroism. You did your duty, and more." "A medal they won't even acknowledge publicly," Henry said bitterly. "A piece of metal for a mission that officially never happened, for men whose names aren't on any memorial wall." And there it was, Jake realized. The real wound. Not just the guilt over his lost friends, but the fact that their sacrifice had been erased, classified away, made invisible just like Henry himself had become. These men had fought and died for their country, and their country couldn't even admit they'd existed. "That's going to change," Jake said firmly. "I don't know how yet, but I'm going to make sure you and your brothers are honored properly. You deserve that. They deserve that." Henry looked at him with tired, skeptical eyes. "You can't change the past, Commander. What's done is done. I'm just trying to get through each day, trying to be useful in the only way I know how." "You're more than useful, Henry. You're an inspiration. And whether you believe it or not, you matter. Your service matters. Your sacrifice matters. And I'm going to prove it to you." They sat there in the truck for a long time, neither speaking. Finally, Henry gave Jake his address, a small apartment in a run-down neighborhood, and Jake drove him home. As the old man got out, he turned back. "Thank you, Commander, for seeing me, for caring. Most people don't. You were never invisible to me, Henry. Not anymore." As Jake drove away, he looked in his rearview mirror and saw Henry standing on the sidewalk, lunch pail in hand, looking smaller and more alone than anyone should ever have to feel. And Jake renewed his vow. He was going to make this right, whatever it took. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of planning and coordination. Commander Jake Morrison worked quietly behind the scenes, calling in favors, reaching out to contacts in Naval Special Warfare Command, and even connecting with historians who specialized in classified Vietnam operations. His goal was simple but challenging: find a way to honor Henry Mitchell and his fallen SOG brothers without violating security protocols or causing problems for the old veteran. Captain Chen backed him completely, using her own connections to navigate the bureaucratic maze. Together, they discovered that several other SOG veterans had been pushing for years to have their unit's service declassified and properly recognized. The 50-year mark since many of their operations meant that some of the restrictions were being lifted, slowly but surely. Meanwhile, Henry continued his work at the gym, seemingly unaware of the efforts being made on his behalf. Jake watched him carefully, noting that the old man seemed more present somehow, as if their conversation had lifted some invisible weight. Henry still kept to himself, but occasionally, Jake would catch him looking at the young SEALs training with an expression that wasn't quite sadness and wasn't quite pride, something deeper and more complex. One morning, Jake arrived early and found Henry in the gym's small memorial corner, a space dedicated to fallen SEALs from the base. The old man was standing in front of the plaque bearing names, his hand raised as if to touch it, but not quite making contact. "They remind you of your team?" Jake asked softly, approaching slowly. Henry didn't turn around. "Every young face I see reminds me. Every time I watch them train, push themselves, trust each other. That was us once. Young, invincible, ready to take on the world." "Tell me about them," Jake said. "Your team. The men who didn't come home." Henry was quiet for so long Jake thought he wouldn't answer. Then, slowly, the old man began to speak, his voice distant, as if he was seeing something far away. Jimmy Carson was the youngest, 22, from a farm in Iowa. Kid could shoot the wings off a fly at 200 yards. Always talked about going home and teaching his little brother to hunt. Tommy Rodriguez, our medic, saved more lives than I can count. Had 3 kids back home, never saw them grow up. Jack Freeman, point man, best jungle fighter I ever saw. He bought it first in the ambush. Took 3 rounds covering the rest of us. Should have been me. I was the leader. Should have been me. Jake listened, letting Henry talk, knowing this was something the old man needed. Then there was Dale Chen, our radio man, Ken Matthews, Billy Shoemaker. Every single one of them trusted me, followed me into that jungle, and I couldn't bring them back, couldn't save them. You brought 3 men back, Henry. 3 men who would have died without you. 3 out of 12, Henry said bitterly. Some record. The men who made it, are they still alive? Henry shrugged. Don't know. We scattered after. The military didn't exactly have support groups for what we went through. We were told to forget it all happened, to never speak of it. So we didn't. Lost touch decades ago. An idea was forming in Jake's mind. What were their names? The survivors? Henry looked at him suspiciously. Why? Just tell me, Henry. Please. Marcus Wright and John Delaney. What are you thinking, Commander? Jake just smiled. Leave it to me. Finding Marcus Wright and John Delaney took Rodriguez's help and a lot of digging. Marcus Wright had passed away 6 years earlier from cancer, but John Delaney was alive and living in Montana, running a small ranch outside of Billings. Jake called him, and after verifying his identity through a series of questions only a real SOG veteran would know the answers to, John opened up. Henry Mitchell? John's voice over the phone was thick with emotion. God, I haven't heard that name in 40 years. How is he? Is he okay? Jake explained the situation, about Henry working as a janitor, about his isolation, about the guilt he still carried. John was quiet for a long time after Jake finished. That's Henry, John finally said. Always blamed himself for things that weren't his fault. Marcus and I tried to tell him back when we first got stateside that he saved our lives, that without him we'd all be dead in that jungle, but he couldn't hear it. The guilt ate him alive. He needs to hear it now, Jake said. From you. Would you be willing to come to California? I'm working on something, a way to honor your team properly. Having you there would mean everything. Commander, I'll walk to California if I have to. Henry Mitchell is the best man I ever knew. If there's a chance to help him find some peace, I'm in. The pieces were falling into place. Captain Chen had gotten approval for a special ceremony to recognize previously classified operations, specifically the contributions of MAC-V SOG units. It would be a small, private event held at the base, with selected active duty personnel and veterans in attendance. The Navy was willing to publicly acknowledge Henry's Navy Cross for the first time, and they were creating a memorial specifically for his fallen team members. But Jake wanted to keep it a surprise. He worried that if Henry knew what was coming, he'd disappear, would find some way to avoid the recognition he so clearly felt he didn't deserve. 3 weeks before the planned ceremony, Jake's plan almost fell apart. Henry didn't show up for work one morning. The first time in 4 years he'd missed a day. Jake immediately drove to his apartment, worried that something had happened to the old man. He found Henry sitting on the front steps of his building, staring at nothing. The old man looked even older than usual, defeated, hollow. "Henry, what's wrong? Are you sick?" Henry looked up, his eyes red. "Got a letter yesterday. From the VA. They're cutting my benefits, saying I don't qualify for certain treatments anymore. Commander, without those benefits, I can't afford my medications. Can't afford the doctor visits that keep the nightmares manageable." Jake felt anger surge through him. This man had given everything, and decades later, bureaucracy was still finding ways to fail him. "Don't worry about it," Jake said firmly. "I'll handle it. You have my word, but right now, I need you at work. The gym is falling apart without you." It wasn't true, but it got Henry moving. Jake drove him to the base and spent the rest of the day on the phone, calling VA offices, pulling strings, making things happen. By evening, he had assurances that Henry's benefits would not only be restored, but increased based on his decorated service record. Captain Chen helped too, connecting Jake with a veterans advocacy group that specialized in cases involving classified service. They were thrilled to take on Henry's case, seeing it as an opportunity to help not just one man, but potentially dozens of other SOG veterans facing similar issues. When Jake told Henry the news that evening, the old man actually cried. "I don't know how to thank you, Commander. I've been fighting this battle alone for so long." "You're not alone anymore, Henry. You hear me? You're not alone." As the ceremony date approached, Jake worked with John Delaney to coordinate his arrival. John would fly in 2 days before, and they'd keep him hidden at a hotel off base. The surprise was crucial. Jake also arranged for a professional videographer to document everything. Even if Henry's service remained partially classified, his team deserved to have their story preserved. The young SEALs at the base had caught wind that something special was happening. Though they didn't know the details, Jake decided to bring them in on it. He gathered his teams one evening and told them about Henry, about SOG, about the sacrifice and service of the quiet janitor they'd walked past 1,000 times without really seeing. The reaction was powerful. These young warriors understood immediately what it meant. They'd been training in a gym cleaned by a legend, taking for granted the presence of someone who'd lived the life they aspired to. One young sailor, a kid barely 21, raised his hand. "Sir, is there anything we can do?" "For him?" Jake smiled. "Actually, there is." On the morning of the ceremony, Henry arrived at work as usual. He'd noticed that the gym was closed for a special event, but Jake had told him it was just a visiting VIP tour and that he should report to the main building instead for a different cleaning assignment. When Henry walked into the base theater, he found it filled with people. Active duty SEALs in dress uniforms, officers, and sitting in the front row, a man Henry hadn't seen in over 40 years. "John?" Henry's voice was barely a whisper. John Delaney stood, tears already streaming down his face. "Hello, brother." The two old warriors embraced, both crying openly, decades of separation and pain melting away in that moment. The audience watched in respectful silence, many of them moved to tears themselves. Captain Chen stepped forward. "Mr. Mitchell, we've brought you here today to correct a long-standing injustice. Your service to this country, the service of your team, has been classified and unacknowledged for far too long. Today, that changes." What followed was the most moving ceremony Jake had ever witnessed. Captain Chen read from declassified mission reports, detailing the operations Henry's team had conducted, the lives they'd saved, the enemy supply lines they'd disrupted. She spoke of the mission into Laos, of the ambush, of Henry's heroism in bringing men home against impossible odds. Then she presented Henry with his Navy Cross, the first time it had been publicly acknowledged. The old janitor stood there in his maintenance uniform, shaking, as the medal was pinned to his chest. The entire room stood and applauded, a thunderous sound that seemed to shake the walls. But Jake wasn't done. He'd saved the most important part for last. A curtain at the back of the stage was pulled aside, revealing a new memorial. It was a bronze plaque listing the names of every man from Henry's team who had died in Laos, with their photographs and a description of their mission. Above it was inscribed, "They answered the call in silence. We honor them in light." Henry walked to the memorial on shaking legs. His fingers traced each name, each face. John Delaney joined him, and together the two old soldiers stood before the images of their fallen brothers, finally able to publicly grieve, to publicly honor, to publicly remember. "I'm sorry," Henry whispered to the photographs. "I'm so sorry I couldn't save you all." John gripped his shoulder. "Henry, you saved me and Marcus. You got us home. You did everything possible and more." These men knew the risks. They went anyway, because they believed in the mission, and they believed in you. Their sacrifice wasn't your failure. It was their choice, their courage, their gift to this country. Jake had arranged for one more surprise. He'd tracked down family members of several of Henry's fallen teammates. Jimmy Carson's younger brother, now in his 60s, was there. So was Tommy Rodriguez's daughter, who'd been only 2 when her father died and had grown up with just photographs and stories. These families had never known the full story of how their loved ones died, had never been able to properly honor them because the missions were classified. Now they could. They met Henry, thanked him through their tears, told him they didn't blame him, that they were grateful he'd tried so hard to bring everyone home. Jimmy Carson's brother, a gray-haired man with his late brother's eyes, hugged Henry fiercely. "My brother wrote home about you, called you the best leader, the best man he'd ever known. He trusted you with his life. That wasn't misplaced, Henry. You earned that trust every day." The ceremony lasted hours. Young SEALs came up to shake Henry's hand, to thank him, to tell him he was an inspiration. Officers who'd never given him a second glance now stood in line to pay their respects. Henry, overwhelmed, kept looking to Jake as if asking for permission to wake up from this dream. Afterward, there was a reception. Henry sat with John Delaney, and the two old friends talked for hours, filling in the gaps of 40 lost years. They laughed and cried and remembered, doing what warriors do when they're finally given permission to process their trauma, their loss, their survival. Jake watched from across the room, feeling a sense of satisfaction deeper than anything he'd felt in his career. This was what leadership meant. Not just training warriors, but taking care of them, seeing them, honoring them, making sure they knew they mattered. Captain Chen joined him. "You did a good thing here, Jake. A really good thing." "We both did, ma'am. Couldn't have made it happen without your support." "What happens now?" To Henry. "That's up to him. But I'm going to make sure whatever he chooses, he's taken care of." In the weeks that followed, Henry's life changed in ways he'd never imagined. The VA not only restored his benefits but gave him full coverage for his service-connected disabilities. A veterans organization set up a fund in honor of his team, providing support for other SOG veterans who'd fallen through the cracks. Henry was offered a position as a consultant to the SEAL training program, sharing his knowledge and experience with the next generation of warriors. He was given an office, a real salary, and most importantly, respect and recognition for what he'd brought to the table. But what Henry treasured most was much simpler. The young SEALs at the base now sought him out, asked him questions, listened to his stories. He wasn't invisible anymore. He wasn't just the janitor. He was Henry Mitchell, Navy Cross recipient, SOG, veteran, warrior, and teacher. One morning, Jake found Henry in the gym, wearing a polo shirt with a SOG patch on it, showing a group of young sailors a technique for room clearing that he'd learned in the jungles of Southeast Asia 50 years ago. The old man's eyes were bright, alive in a way Jake had never seen before. When the training session ended and the young sailors left, Henry approached Jake. "Commander, I need to say something. I need you to understand what you've done." "Henry, you don't have to. Please, let me say this." The old man's voice was thick with emotion. "For 50 years, I've been dead inside, carrying guilt, carrying pain, feeling like I didn't deserve to be alive when my brothers weren't. I've been hiding, trying to be invisible, because being seen meant being reminded of my failures." "Henry, let me finish. What you did, bringing John here, honoring my team, giving them that memorial, it didn't erase the pain. Nothing can do that. But it gave me permission to feel something other than guilt. It reminded me that I was more than the worst day of my life. You gave me back my story, Commander. You gave me back my brothers. You gave me back myself." The two men embraced, warrior to warrior, generation to generation. both understanding that sometimes the greatest battles are the ones we fight within ourselves, and sometimes the greatest victories are simply finding peace. 6 months later, Henry Mitchell published a memoir with the help of that veterans advocacy group. It detailed his time in SOG, the missions, the losses, the brotherhood. It became required reading at the SEAL Training Center. Young warriors learned from it, were inspired by it, understood that the true measure of a soldier wasn't just physical courage, but the moral courage to carry on when everything seemed lost. Henry lived another 8 years, remaining active at the base, mentoring young sailors, and making sure that the story of SOG and his fallen brothers was never forgotten. When he finally passed away peacefully in his sleep at age 82, his funeral was held with full military honors. Hundreds attended, from the youngest SEAL trainees to the highest-ranking admirals. John Delaney gave the eulogy, his voice strong despite his own advanced age. Henry Mitchell spent most of his life thinking he'd failed, but he never failed. He saved lives in the jungle. He saved my life, and Marcus's life. And later, by sharing his story, by letting himself be seen, he saved countless others who were carrying their own invisible wounds. He showed us that it's okay to struggle, okay to hurt, but it's also okay to heal. That was his final gift to us all. Commander Jake Morrison, now an admiral himself, stood at the grave as Henry was laid to rest. He thought about that morning years ago when he'd first really seen the quiet janitor, when he'd noticed the tattoo and started asking questions. One small moment of paying attention, of seeing someone who'd been invisible, had changed everything. The memorial at the base still stood, bronze plaque gleaming, listing the names of Henry's fallen team. But now, next to it was another plaque. It bore a quote from Henry's memoir. "They carried me through the jungle when I was wounded. I carry them in my heart every day. We are never truly alone when we remember those who gave everything." And beneath that quote was a simple inscription. Henry Mitchell, Navy Cross recipient, Mac V SOG, 1946 to 2034. He showed us that the greatest warriors are not those who never fall, but those who rise again and help others do the same. Jake stood there for a long time, remembering the old man who'd cleaned floors and emptied trash cans while carrying such heavy honor. He thought about how easy it was to walk past people, to not see them, to not ask their stories. He thought about the young SEALs training in that gym, learning from Henry's example even now, and he made a promise, standing there by the grave. He would never stop seeing people, never stop asking questions, never stop honoring those who served, whether their service was public or classified, recent or decades old. Because everyone had a story. Everyone mattered. And sometimes, the most important thing a leader could do was simply pay attention. The sun was setting over the Pacific, painting the sky in shades of gold and purple. Jake saluted one final time, then turned and walked back toward the base. Behind him, the memorial stood as a permanent reminder that no sacrifice should be forgotten, no warrior should be invisible, and no story of courage and redemption should go untold. Henry Mitchell had spent most of his life in the shadows. But in the end, his light shone bright enough to illuminate the path for countless others. And that, Jake thought, was the truest measure of a hero. Not someone who never falls, but someone who rises, who helps others rise, and who shows us all that healing is possible, if we're brave enough to let ourselves be seen.